Hey, what's up everybody? It's Magdk Gamer coming back with another video. This video is a little different than what I normally do. Today I wanted to actually talk about Magdk and why, when looking at the Magdk compared to many of the other classes, they really do need a rework. The reason being is I wanted to actually compare. The easiest comparison for Magdk would be Templar, because from the developer standpoint, they're both considered a stand your ground sort of class. With that said, there's a lot of problems with Magdk and their ability to stand their ground from when you look at it primarily just from a skill and passive standpoint. And so to actually be able to balance classes, I only wanted to just take a look at the class, look at the passives, look at the abilities, and compare them pound for pound, and to see which class is better built to stand its ground. With that said, I wanted to start primarily with Magdk's passives. The passives that Magdk have are typically very poor. They lack a lot of regen passives, and their skills are far too expensive, with very few options for either reduction or regen within their passives. With that said, looking at the combustion passive increases the burning status effect and increases that damage by 50%. Primary problem with it is that, of course, the burning passive is a damage that takes place, but it's situational. Of course, to actually make use of it, you'd have to use like a charged weapon. Thankfully, Magdk does have quite a few dots that it's able to place the burning on, but the primary problem is that their other classes have too many abilities to negate the damage over time effects that Magdk has, and Magdk has no way of removing many of the dots by comparison that are placed on them. And of course, with that, they gain whenever they do apply that burning status effect, then they restore 500 magicka. Of course, it's magicka or stamina, and it's on a 5-second cooldown. That is basically a 200 regen, but it's situational. It's conditional. The condition is that you have to have the burning status effect on that person. And of course, if the person is playing, for example, a Dark Elf, if you are a Dark Elf, which I always recommend for most DPSs, the primary reason is if you look at the passive and the fire resist passive makes you immune to the burning status effect. And so if you're fighting another Magdk, for example, you don't get this regen, because this regen that you're supposed to receive is primarily based on having the burning effect on someone. So especially coming with the next patch where Dark Elf is going to be very strong, this is going to hurt Magdk's sustain even more than it already is, because there's a lot of ways to mitigate the burning effect, whether it's through cloak, other sources, for example, where is it? In the support tree, like Purge, reduces the Magdk sustain, or if they're a Templar, or if there's a Templar in the area who can then cleanse them. And of course, this affects Magdk's sustain quite a bit, because 200 magicka or stamina, depending upon how you're built, is quite a bit of regen that you're primarily losing. Not only are you losing that, but then you're also losing the 50% bonus, because those abilities are either cleansed or cloaked, and there's so many Nightblades. And this is one of the primary reasons that in the war of attrition versus a Nightblade, DK is on the losing side, because most of DK's abilities are dots. The only burst damage that they have is primarily Whip, Flames of Oblivion, and Leap. A lot of Magdk's don't utilize Inhale because Inhale is far too expensive for what it does. But going back into the passive, so that's one of the problems literally just with their first passive in Combustion, why they suffer a lot from regen. One of the things that Magdk lacks is mobility, as well as the ability to reliably gap close to their opponent. And so with that, they have the warmth passive, but it lasts 3 seconds whenever you use an ardent flame ability. This is actually one of the good passives that they have, but again, because of things like forward momentum and cleanse, this can be easily shaken off. Or of course, if you're a warden gains a 15% reduction to all movement speed snares. And talking about, I find that this is a very useless passive. Talk about why. It increases the damage of all of your fiery breath, searing strike, and of course your DK standard, but it's 3%. 3%. So if, for example, your whip has a 10k tooltip, you gain an extra 90 damage to your whip. So if your whip hits for 10k, you have a 10k tooltip on your whip. This increases your tooltip by a whopping 300 damage. And then of course it increases engulfing by 2 seconds, and of course the damage over time length of burning embers, as well as DK standard by 2 seconds. The problem with that is that typically you don't gain the benefit of that, because you primarily will be using burning embers as a burst heal, and so you never really get the chance for it to run out, because you're constantly reapplying it, because a lot of Magdk heals are very expensive, and this is actually your cheapest one that you can utilize in a fight, which you should be doing, to be able to gain a burst heal for a very cheap amount of Magdk. So point for point, this is actually one of the best DK abilities in terms of healing, because the healing is based off the damage. The problem is, again, with things like Templar cleanse, whether you're using like efficient purge, or if you're fighting like a Nightblade, whether it's a Stam or Magdk, because cloak reduces all dot damage to 0. When that Nightblade does come back out of cloak and then you re-swipe after you've been bursted, the amount of heal that you get is reduced to almost nothing, because they haven't taken any damage. The only damage that they've taken is from the initial swipe. The other problem is that the initial swipe is dodgeable, and of course if they dodge it, they dodge both the swipe as well as the dot that's associated with it, which means you've wasted that Magdk, which means you don't get heals. So again, this is another problem with Magdk, and it impacts Magdk's ability to sustain, because between engulfing and embers, you're going to be putting dots for the purpose of doing damage, as well as trying to take advantage of the combustion passive. But because of things like cloak, efficient purge, and the Templar purge, Magdk often doesn't get the benefit. Magdk often doesn't get the benefit of either their heal, the damage, or the passive regen that they should be getting when applying the burning status effect. Also, because the duration increase often between engulfing and embers you typically don't end up reaching the full time limit, like I said, because of constantly having to re-embers people to gain the heal. So in essence, that extra 2 seconds that you would benefit, really you only get from using standard. And then in Worlds in Ruin, again, the amount of damage increase is it's 6% to all of your area effect. And it says here, increases the damage of your flame area of effects by 6%. So that would be things like engulfing and standard. The primary problem with standard is standard, even on a DPS build, has a fairly low tooltip. You'll probably be sitting around 3k and 4k per tick. The problem is is that that's really only an increase of about 240. And again, that is on the tooltip, right? If you've got a 4K per tick, you gain an additional 6%. That's 240. You have to keep in mind that in Cyrodiil, that damage is cut in half. So you're only getting 120 extra damage per tick to all of your AoEs. Again, engulfing has a 10-second duration. On a decent build, you're probably going to sit around between 10 and 12k. So all you're getting in terms of damage increase from World and Ruins is roughly 600, and that's before the 50% reduction when you go into Cyrodiil, which means that that 10k dot now does 5k, and you're only getting an additional 300. Again, this is over 10 seconds before any sort of mitigation. So it's a 5k, it does 5k damage over 10 seconds. So it's about 500 damage per second before any mitigation, and then you get an extra 10% on top of that, which is an extra 500 damage. Not a lot of damage. Again, and then for some reason, stamina DKs gain a freaking whopping 25% reduction. So I want you to see how cheap the other morph Noxious is. It's 2,300, and that's before running any medium armor. So it's 2295, and with the passive, it drops down. You can compare the difference, right? You look at the difference between engulfing, and we're just looking at the base. We're not talking about running any reduction or running light, running medium. It's about a 500 difference just in the base morph. But then when you add the 25% reduction, that turns into 1,700. It costs 1,000 less than the Magdk version. That's a lot. It's almost, again, it's a huge reduction that they get, and of course that's before running any other sources of reduction, like whether you're running any medium armor. The other issue in terms of the amount of regen resources that Magdk struggles, again, you're looking at the Magdk version is 1350, and the Stam version 861. Again, it's roughly 500 Magdk, 500 in terms of your maximum resource, cheaper. And it does more damage because this one increases the amount of damage on the length of time. So as a Stam DK, you're primarily not spamming Venomous Claw because you're ramping up the damage as you go, and they don't use this ability to heal. So typically you will get the increase in damage, you will get the benefit of the extra time as well as the extra damage, whereas Magdk doesn't. Looking at the abilities, looking at pound for pound in Flame Lash, the base morph is 891. The primary problem with Flame Lash is that Power Lash requires way too much for it to be made useful. You have to CC your opponent, you have to whip them, then you have to Power Lash them. And that Power Lash now has a cost. It's 50% of the base cost. So when you Power Lash someone, it costs 1,200-ish Magdk. The problem is that Power Lash can be dodged, and then it goes on cooldown because it says this effect can occur once every 3 seconds. So not only does it then cost you Magdk to use, you also don't get the benefit of the heal. And this is Magdk's primarily burst heal that they get that's not attached to whether or not, actually, excuse me, this does 75% of the damage. So it's got a 1500 tooltip, so roughly it's doing, let's pull up a simple calculator. So just talking about the base, we're looking at a 1500 tooltip times 0.75, and you get an 1125 heal, which is roughly 660 less than what Power Lash would give you. The problem is that this ability ends up going on cooldown, And in fighting other stand builds, it gets dodged fairly often. And again, because it now has a cost associated with it, and because a lot of times you're not getting the benefit of the combustion passive, this impacts Magdk's ability to win the war of attrition, which is what Magdk is primarily originally built, designed out sustaining your opponent, and of course whittling them down with dots and not burst damage. It's one of the reasons why the developers refuse to give Magdk an execute. Literally every other spec in the game, whether it's Stam or Magdk, whether it's Warden, whether it's Sorc, Templar, Nightblade, even Stam DK, all have access to an execute. The only build that doesn't have access to an execute is Magdk. And the developers refuse to give the class an execute, imagining that it's going to become overpowered, and that's often why you see Magdks will use their leap as their execute, because they don't have access to one. Dots typically don't do enough damage, and so what you'll see is a lot of Magdks whittling down people with their whip. It's often why you see Magdks in heavy armor and sword and shield, because they need all of that reduction in damage to whittle down their opponent, because they end up, otherwise they would end up taking huge amounts of damage. Typically when you see Magdks that are running like light armor with shields typically don't work that great on Magdk, because one, shields are expensive, and two, Magdk doesn't have a lot of reduction and regen in their kit to support spamming shields. Primary issue is that classes like Sorc as well as Magdk Nightblade have tons of regen in their kit. Sorc has a lot of both reduction and regen, as well as having minor magic of recovery tied into their shield, which has a longer duration, and they utilize shields far better than Magdk do. But moving on, one of the passives that I think that should be changed is the Iron Skin, as it does increase the amount of damage that you can block. But the primary problem is that when you're not blocking, this does absolutely nothing for you. If you're running anything other than a sword and shield, then you're not even gaining the benefit, because if you're running dual wield, or if you're running a staff, or any other weapon choice for that matter, outside of maybe an ice staff and sword and shield, this does nothing for you, because you're not going to be able to take advantage of it often enough for it to be made useful. And so I would change this to something that benefits DK, that's more in line with their skills. Looking at their volatile armor, definitely a good skill, nothing to complain. It does a lot. It does a dot if you cast it around people, as well as giving you all of your major buffs, and of course it reflects a little bit of damage. My primary problem is things like talons. The base cost of talons is 4k. You either get minor maim or you gain, and this is the damage morph, and you can see that the difference in the damage morph is not that much. It literally does an extra 2k damage versus the 15% reduction, and this is primarily always the better choice, because reducing the amount of damage you take by 15% is better than the extra 550 ticks that you'll get, and you only get 4 ticks, if that. So the additional, yeah, it's over 4 seconds. It ticks every 1 second, I believe, and if not, maybe it's 2, which then you only gain an extra roughly 1100 damage, while not opting to take the 15% damage reduction. This isn't my choice, and my opinion is always the choice to take as a Magdk, especially because It's basically designed to lock its opponents down. The extra damage, typically not worth it. Magdk Coag is one of the most expensive heals in the game, and I want to compare it to the Templar, who was also a stand your ground build. And if you look at their ability to their self heal, it is slightly more, right? Honor the Dead has a base heal of 1350, right? But if you look at the DKs, right? DKs, Templars is 1350. DK heal is 846. So that's roughly half. It's almost half of what it costs. And the DK version only costs roughly about 250 less Magicka. Now, the primary problem is that Templar ability actually heals almost 4 times as much when you take into effect the fact that if you choose the other morph, you will then gain double the amount of healing. So not only is it's 1273 plus an additional 822. So that's literally a 2000 heal, over 2000. It's like 2200. It's just about 2200 because it heals you and it heals another person. It does far more than the Magdk version, and it only costs 200 more. Now, if you just want to consider from a solo perspective, if you're a solo Templar, looking at pound for pound, how much you gain. Again, it's got a almost 4600. We'll just say it's 4600 for the purpose of this. But when you heal yourself below 75%, which Magdk would not use Coag when they're at 75% because it costs far too much to use, Templar gains a 60% reduction to the cost of the skill that they receive back in regen. Again, looking at so if you were to multiply this times 0.6, excuse me, we'll just do, it's 4600 times 0.4, which is what the actual cost of the skill would be when utilizing this at below 75%. Cost 1800. It's literally less than half of what the Magdk version would cost you. It's actually almost like 2.5 times cheaper, and it heals for 50% more. Roughly about, yeah, I'd say roughly about 45 to 50% more. The other issue is that when you're looking at Templar, they actually gain a benefit to healing themselves at lower HP, which is 12%. They gain a 12% bonus to this heal, on top of the fact if they're standing in their rune or in their cleansing ritual, they gain another 8%. So not only are they getting huge amounts of reduction, which again adds into their ability to stand their ground and maintain their resources, they're also gaining the benefit of having increased options, up to 20% more healing for literally like a 1/3 of the cost. And so this plays a huge role in why Templar is able to stand their ground far better and not be forced into utilizing Sword and Shield, and why Magdk typically is forced into using a Sword and Shield, especially when they're fighting multiple opponents. And so yes, while it does have the benefit of increasing the heal by 33% based on your missing health, the problem is that to gain the full benefit of this, you have to basically be sitting in execute range. And again, because Magdk doesn't have an execute, basically ZeniMax is saying for you to gain the benefit of your heal, we want you to sit in execute range and not have an execute while every other class and build style doesn't have to do that. Magdk is the only build that has to sit and execute range to gain the benefit of their burst heal, and no other class has to do that. Again, they gain the benefit of the block passive, but again, unless you're using a sword and shield, it does absolutely nothing for you. The only skill that Magdk can use to take advantage of the Burning Heart is Spiked Armor. Nothing else in Magdk's kit will get this passive to proc. Not Talons, not Dragon Blood, not Reflective Scales, not Inhale. The only thing that you can use to make use of this is Hardened Armor. So if your Hardened Armor ever goes down, or if you don't want to use Hardened Armor and you want to use like shields, for example, because maybe you've got 2 shields and then maybe 3 shields between like the Earth and Heart shield, or whether you're using the Light Armor shield and then the other shield from the rest of the wall, and maybe you don't use it, you don't gain the benefit of the passive. Elder Dragon, one of the most useless passives. 5% increase in health recovery. Again, on your main bar, what are you gonna have? You might have Talent. Typically, Hardened Armor is on your back bar. Dragon Leap might be on your front bar. So at most, you're gonna have 10% extra health recovery. Again, a lot of Magdks don't stack health recovery, and a lot of Magdks find themselves going Vamp just to have some sort of mobility related to using Vampire Mistform. So typically, this passive is almost useless. Again, a lot of the abilities that are considered melee, like for example, Lava Whip, Flame Whip, got a nerf. It used to base be 7 meters. They nerfed it to then buff it. Just basically to buff things like Searing Strike, Fiery Breath are the primary ones that gain a benefit to it, but the secondary portion of this passive primarily benefits Stamdk and not Magdk. So looking at the Scaled Armor, I actually think that they should change this to a split. I'd rather see it be both physical and spell resistance instead of just spell resistance, because the meta for a long time has been Stam builds, and that's typically where Magdk will find himself having a hard time fighting other Stam builds because of bleeds. And again, it's not like it would help, but you can have any one of this passive and this passive be slightly better built for a stand your ground build. Looking at Reflective Scales, the ability that so many people complain about, especially Magicka Nightblades. Again, reflecting for the cost of 3,500 Magicka. So literally to reflect maybe four abilities, it costs you 3,500 Magicka. Divided that by 4, it costs you 875 Magicka per light attack or per ability that you reflect. Now, if a Magdk finds himself snared, it costs him 3,500 Magicka just to remove immobilizations or snares. That is a huge amount of sustain loss. You're either forced to spam Reflective Plate or sit in the root or just literally be permanently slowed, and Magdk doesn't have access to a suitable gap closer. The reason being is because for the longest time, Empowering Chains has been bugged. It costs far too much to use, as well as that typically if the person is like on a different y-axis, the ability does not fire, and while it can't be dodged, The primary problem is that for 3500 Magicka, you're doing a whopping 471 damage. And when you compare that, for example, to the Templar one, and this doesn't stun. So not only does it not stun, you do gain access to Major Expedition, but it's a whopping 4 seconds that you typically don't even get a chance to take advantage of. So it's 471 damage for a base of 3500. Again, even if you're running like 3500 spell damage, and this is a no CP build and a roughly around 30k Magicka, it does about 3500. So you're literally doing 3500 damage. Again, that's before the 50% reduction for 3500 Magicka. When you take a look at the Templar version, pound per pound for the cost, again, 471 tooltip, we're looking at the base for 3500 Magicka. You compare that to the Templar version that you get a choice to stun. Again, same cost. And you see the difference is roughly about 20%. And it stuns. Or you do an AoE and then pound for pound the ability exponentially does so much more damage. So you either gain access to a stun. It's also important to understand that yes, it does about 20% and it stuns, but then it also has the ability to proc Burning Light, which then literally doubles the amount of damage that it can do. So your explosive charge, or whether you choose the toppling charge, have the same amount, but then you're looking at, if it procs, it's literally doing 1000 damage and the CC for the same cost that Magdk has, and it literally does about a third of the damage for the same cost and no CC. And of course, it's still broken. That I've tried using it. I use it on my Magdk that I was streaming last week, and I don't know how many times where I'm literally trying to gap close to the person and they're on a slightly different incline and the ability doesn't fire. Going back to Magdk and comparing, again, this is one of Magdk's best skills. Flames of Oblivion. It is a dot. It does really good damage. The primary problem that I have with it is, at the very least, this can be made more like an execute if they were to change the ability to target the person with the lowest HP instead of the nearest HP. So for example, if you're fighting multiple opponents and you get someone really low and that person kind of dodge rolls or streaks away, this ability can act like a finisher by targeting the lowest person instead of the nearest person. And that's the only change that I would make to this ability. Again, the smart heal works the same way. It targets the person with the lowest HP because it's a smart heal, right? So launches a fireball and an eye to cauterize their wounds every 5 seconds, but it acts as a smart heal. It will target the lowest HP person in the area. So again, I would change Flames of Oblivion to act that same way. Whoever is the lowest target around you, it persistently fires at that person. And so what that does is that gives you that continued ability to pressure low health targets who have dots placed on them. And it gives you 4 ticks for really good cost. 2160 Magicka for roughly 2500, because you gain 1 tick on the initial cast if you're within range, as well as 3 more ticks afterwards. And of course it gives you both major savagery and major sorcery, major prophecy. So it's a really good skill. When it hits, it still procs the warmth passive, which allows you to stay within range, But changing this over to, like I said, to targeting the lowest health would really help Magdk secure more kills, because it doesn't have access to an execute. And so that will help you not to be forced into holding your ult to when your opponent is low health. One ability that has been persistently inadvertently nerfed is Deep Breath, primarily because there aren't a lot of abilities that can be interrupted outside of like Jesus Beam and Resurrection. Jabs can't be. It used to be. Wrecking Blow used to be interruptible. Used to be able to utilize this ability when you have multiple people that are Wrecking Blowing you, and so when they were casting Wrecking Blow, this would interrupt them. And again, this is the ability that is supposed to kind of offset the pressure that Magdk is getting, but this ability is absolutely useless because there are no people can be interrupted by this. Again, the only thing that you can interrupt is Jesus Beam and resurrecting someone, and it has a 4K cost and it does very little damage for the amount of cost. It does do AoE damage. I would change this ability to stun AoE on the initial hit, because typically when you use this ability and they see you use the initial inhale portion, they move out of range of the exhale. And so this would help the ability to land often, and it would give Magdk the pressure relief it needs when it's surrounded by multiple opponents. The other morph of Draw Essence also, again, has the same problem, is that the reduction to the skill cost only takes place during the exhale. And so I would actually change this morph that the inhaled portion actually gains the reduction, and then you gain a bonus to the heal portion based on the people who are still around you. So again, you still have the ability to move out of range because it doesn't have a stun, but what it does have is access to a larger heal, because even on a well-built DK, the tooltip is really small. It's roughly, maybe, even if it was 3k, the initial portion. In Cyrodiil, it does half damage, and the heal is based on the damage. So even if you have, I mean, it's very hard to get 3k. Typically, you're going to have a tooltip of about 2.5k. That means you have a 1250 heal per person based on a cost of 4k Magdk. So it's a really small heal. This got nerfed inadvertently when they made the change to Entropy and Empower, because Empower would increase the damage by, what was it, 20%? And so it actually made the heal fairly decent, because the Empower was only on the initial damage, not on the secondary portion of it. So you can actually take advantage of the Empower for the initial inhale, which is what gave you the heal. But then when they nerfed that, they in essence nerfed this ability by 20%. So it made it very useless to use. Again, a lot of times people move out of range of the exhale, and it's the exhaled portion that gives you the restoration of the cost. I would change that to on the inhale portion, based on how many people around you. When you inhale, it reduces the amount of the cost of the ability, and those still trapped in the exhale, you heal again for a portion of the exhaled damage. And what this would do is it was give Magdk the ability to sustain its HP when it's surrounded by multiple opponents, which is exactly what Magdk needs. I was never in favor of them buffing coagulation, because 1v1 Magdk was always king because of their ability to lock down their opponent, and because they had access to swiping for HP, and because of being able to use Fossilize into a Power Lash. They really didn't have a hard time maintaining their HP in a 1v1. The primary problem where Magdk starts to feel the pressure is when they're surrounded by multiple opponents. Again, since Magdk is designed as a stand your ground and attrition, a war of attrition, being able to whittle down your opponent slowly because it doesn't have an execute, this change would make that more possible without making them overpowered. And again, I would change some of the passive to maybe just a straight 12% more healing, so that you're not forced into running Sparked Armor, even though why would you not? And gaining more access to physical reduction, as well as changing this to something that all Magdks that aren't forced into blocking utilize. Again, because the amount of damage increased is 10%, but the base block is 50%. So the maximum amount of damage that you can block is straight 50%. This stacks on top of that, so it really only mitigates 5% of damage when you block, and that's just because of how the block percent increases stack. So it's not that fantastic of passage. It really only blocks 5% damage, and it's only when you block. Looking at the Earth and Heart, there are a lot of overly expensive abilities. Again, for a CC, this pound for pound is the best heal that Magdk has access to. The primary problem, again, is that it is a risk reward, but the risk far outlies the reward. I would change this ability instead of, again, it acts like a smart heal. So if you have a friendly next to you and you hit somebody with this, for example, let's say you have 30k, but you're sitting at 50%. So now you're at 15k HP, but the guy next to you has 20k, and he's also at 15k, but he's at 75% HP. You're closer to execute range than he is, but because you have the same numerical value, it will typically go to him because he's sitting. I find this happen very often. The moment he ticks slightly lower than you, even though percent wise you're at a lower percent closer to execute range, which is when you should be using this ability, it won't go to you. I would change this ability to act like an AoE, so that it can hit you and up to maybe 2 more people who are next to you. This way, the problem is it can be reflected with either wings or the sword and shield ability. Defensive posture, it can be absorbed and then you don't get the heal. Another thing is, if a warden is using like shimmering, when it gets absorbed, it doesn't heal you. And so I would change this at the very least to be an AoE so that you do get the heal. The other issue is that it costs far too much, and it can be dodged. It can be reflected, and it can be absorbed. So there's far too much risk for the type of reward that you're trying to offer you. Stone Fist, I feel, is perfect. It does exactly what it should. When used correctly, you can burst someone down between a Stone Fist into a double whip power lash, and it does a lot of damage. It works really good, does double damage when you CC, and of course it has a nice reduced cost, 800 less. That's huge. It could still use a cost reduction, and then it gives you access to both of the minor rewards, which is fantastic. It can also take advantage of the Helping Hands, as well as Mountain's Blessing, and of course it has a nice long CC to it as it's 3 seconds. Molten Armaments, Molten Weapons, I don't think anybody uses this. It needs some sort of a rework. Ash Cloud, again, far too expensive. 4,600 for either a very mediocre damage. It's 5 meters wide. The snare is useless because people can just kite behind you. The damage is lackluster for the cost. Same thing for the healing. The healing is so mediocre, it's not even worth using for the amount of cost. Again, because Magdk is forced into standing its ground, when you compare this, again, it's 4,600 with a 214 per second. It lasts 15 seconds. But if you're to compare this to the Templar version, which is the cleanse, there's just no comparison. Oops. So looking at the Templar, again, we're comparing the two stand your ground builds. It costs slightly less, and it heals for about 85. If it were doing per second, it costs 85. It heals for 85 per second, but it also cleanses you of 5 effects. So that's huge. And because it's huge, it's 12 meters. It's literally like 2.5 times the size of the DK version, and it has a snare attached to it that's just as good because it's much harder to kite around a Templar. This thing is huge, and it does really decent heals. It has a synergy attached to it. The DK version does not. The heal, again, because you're standing in it, it gains the benefit of the 12% based on your healing, as well as automatically giving you minor mending while you're standing in it. And of course, it reduces all movement speed by 30%. Again, this is the far better version, and again, it's cheaper. It does more. It's 2.5 times the size, and it gains the benefit of 20% heal. So it literally is half the healing, and it does a far better job at aiding the Templar to stand his ground, whereas the DK version is just far too expensive and typically why no one uses it. Looking at Igneous Shield, needs a huge cost reduction for what it does. All it does, it gives you a mediocre shield. In CP, you're lucky if you get, in Cyrodiil, you're lucky if this is a 1k shield for 4k cost. DKs primarily use it for the major mending attached to it, as well as taking advantage of both Helping Hands and the ult gen that they get from utilizing this ability. It's far too expensive for what it does. Again, Templars have access to up to 20% for standing in their AoE version of Ash Cloud, as well as receiving heals from it. Whereas the DK utilizes this, and it's a joke. You're trading 4k Magdk for 1k Stam. It's a joke. It got nerfed so bad and needs a rework. If you look back at DK of old and you were to take a look at how big the shield is, you can take a look at, for example, looking at Cypher PK. Cypher PK played Magdk for a long time, and if you look back,
educational comment.
Pause that. If you look back at his Magdk gameplay from like 4 years ago, let's take a look. There we go. And we're looking back like 4 years back. take a look. We'll take a look and you'll see when he utilizes, and this is like, whew, DK of old style. And you'll see when he uses it. And then back in the days, Ash Cloud gave you evasion, and of course it needed it. And you'll see, you'll take a look when he uses Cloud, boom. It's roughly 33% of his HP back in the days. Again, Ash Cloud gave him the reduction in damage because it gave you major evasion of old, as well as having access to a damage shield that would give you roughly a third of your HP, and you needed that because you were forced into using Dragon Blood to when you were low HP. Again, you had to sit in execute range to take advantage of coagulating blood. Now, the real kicker is if you want to get a really good heal, you've got to spend 4K plus another 4,300 to take advantage of major mending with coagulating blood. That's 8,300 in resource. That's literally on a Magdk running 40k Magicka. You're spending 20% of your Magicka to heal. 20% to gain the big heal. It's ridiculously, it's costly. It is not an efficient way. It's not an efficient way to gain and utilize bursty heals, whereas StamDK doesn't have to do that because it can utilize Igneous to gain back its stand as well as gain the major mending, and then it utilizes its stam to use vigor. And so it works far better on StamDK than it does on Magdk, and it needs a rework. Petrify, the Shattering Rocks version, actually got nerfed because before it used to have 100% chance of making your opponent off balance. They nerfed it to 50% and then they removed it altogether. And the heal that you get is actually not even directed to you, but only to the person the enemy attacks. Again, it's 4 seconds. So when that person dodge rolls and repositions, there's a good chance you don't even get the heal. Fossilize, everybody complains about it because they're forced to break CC break and then roll dodge. This primarily affects Magicka builds more than it does Stam builds, but again, Magdk has no real gap closer that can use, and all of its damage abilities are melee range, less than 10 meters. Most of their abilities are like 9 meters, and Magdk doesn't really have access to major expedition outside of using the broken chains. Change is far too expensive for the amount of damage that it does and the mediocre movement speed that it gives you, and it's typically why most DKs don't use it, and most DKs just try to take advantage of Fossilize. Fossilize got nerfed. It used to be 15 meters, they moved it down to 8, and so it took a pretty decent nerf. It's still very good ability. Ash Cloud again, very useless. The primary problem with Mountain's Blessing is that most of the time, if you're not running Igneous, you have no access to this passive ult regen because CC is 7 seconds. If your opponent is using like a CC pot, if they're using the immunity pot, which is 14 seconds, this passive is useless because then you don't gain access if you're not running Igneous. Again, Igneous will last 6 seconds, but it's far too expensive. 4K Magicka just to gain access to 3 ult, it's far too expensive when you compare like things like Warden or Nightblade, which or Templar for that matter. You look at Templar only has to spend like 1,800 Magicka to gain access to their version of their ult regen, and it's based on a damage ability, whereas this is typically based on either a CC or a utility. And again, because the shield is basically shit, the only time that you're going to use it is when you're low stam, maybe, or when you need to heal. So for the most part, The only way that you're going to gain access to this is when your opponent is CC'd, and of course that is on a 7-second cooldown, and this is on a 6-second cooldown. So it needs to be either buffed or brought in line. Again, stam DKs only utilize this when they need stamina or healing, and if you're not using it on a 6-second rotation, this actually is a regen loss to Magdk and stam DK, and primarily the only way that they have access to regen is via Battle Roar. And again, we just before, most DKs primarily utilize their leap as an execute, so they end up holding onto their ultimate, and the longer you hold your ult past the ability to use it, you start to gain diminishing returns to Battle Roar. Because if you utilize leap, which has 125 cost, and you gain 46 per ult, it's roughly a 5750 return to your HP. It's actually half of that in CP, so divided by 2, and that's the heal that you get to your HP. But then again, times 2, that's your resource. That's literally 2 whips, because whip costs so much that unless you're running light armor and cost reduction, it literally only gives you enough regen to whip your opponent. Now, outside of any other ult, typically we'll divide that by 3, because that's what you get, 3 per ult. Unless you're running like Bloodspawn or something else, typically it's about 42 seconds before you can gain access to your passive. Otherwise, that passive in Earth and Heart is doing nothing for you. And so that's primarily the problem, is that DK is not able to take advantage of the passive until they use their ult. Typically you only use your ult when either you're trying to gain an execute or you're starving for resources, and then you have to wait sometimes up to 40 plus seconds just to gain access to the passive again. It's a very inefficient passive, and it needs a rework. The other thing I wanted to discuss was when you were to compare DK's stand your ground ultimate, the ultimate still doesn't work. Every patch I test it, and every patch I'm disappointed that it doesn't work. I've tested it numerous times in battlegrounds. When I know I'm going to be surrounded, I will pop it and I will see my HP drop. I'll look back at my death recap. I'm taking normal damage. It's supposed to reduce all incoming damage to no more than 3% of your healing, as well as either putting a damage shield or bypassing your opponent's physical resistance. But typically it doesn't work. I've tried it. I've tried the Stam version as well as the Magdk version, and it's not reliable. On my Stam DK, I typically will use the shield ult because it's better. It reflects all projectiles as well as blocking all incoming damage without having to block. And of course it's cheaper. It's only 125, whereas the DK version is 200 ult. Again, when you compare this, the DK's stand your ground ult is 200 ultimate. It does 135 per tick for 9 seconds. You compare that to the Templar. The Templar's version is far better. It's 75 ultimate, and again, we're not even talking about comparing the fact that Templar also gains access to reduction. They reduced their ult by 4%, so it's really 72 ult. It's like 1/3 of the cost of the Magdk version, but it also does a better job because it does damage. It does far more damage. It does 800 damage up front, and then it does 3 more ticks of 426. This is the physical version, and then you have the magical version. And of course, the magical version gains burst, whereas the physical version gains damage reduction via major protection for 6 seconds. That's a minimum of 6 seconds. It also gains access to burning light. So at a minimum, it will tick once, at least once. So it'll gain an additional 470 damage, depending upon which morph you choose. So it literally does, right, it lasts 6 seconds. So it has the upfront 876 plus 3 ticks. So that's an additional 1275. And then plus 470. So it does a total of 2621 for 1/3 the cost, and reduces damage for a minimum of 6 seconds by 30%. Far better option. And of course, it also gives you access to the passives. While you have it slotted, you do 10% more critical damage, as well as 10% more damage to blocking targets. And it also gives you access to minor protection. This is when activating an Aegis Spear ability, again, we activate Empowering Sweep, we gain access to both major and minor reduction. So you reduce the damage by 38 for a minimum of 3 seconds, and then the remaining 30% reduction remains for the other 3 seconds. And it does overwhelmingly more damage, 2621, whereas the Magdk version lasts 9 seconds, costs almost 3 times as much, and does less than half the damage, because it lasts, even with the passive, Eternal Mountain increases it to 10.8. So it literally does half the damage, and often it does not work. It's broken. It's been broken for a long time. The only real benefit to using it is that Battle Roar, you'll get a bigger heal from Battle Roar, and of course when you activated it in an area around with friendlies, it will give them a damage shield of 50% in Cyrodiil. But it often fails. It doesn't protect you. I've been blown up through it several times where I don't even use it anymore. I was very disappointed. It still doesn't work. And it's been like this for a very long time. Like, you literally have to sit down. If you compare just the regen passives of Sork compared to Magdk, it's ridiculous how much regen Sork has. They gain rebate, Magicka back when one of their pet dives. They gain ult reduction. They gain regen. Expert Summoner increases their health. They gain 10% more to their Magicka recovery when utilizing Empowered Ward. When looking at, they have access to Dark Deal, where they can trade one resource for another. Look at the cost. Magdk has to spend 4k Magicka to gain back 1000 stam, and Sorcerer, either just as the Magicka version, it's almost half the cost. It gives you a burst heal, and it gives you back stamina up front, as well as stamina over time, as well as giving you access. Again, they also have access to persistence. So if you were running a block build like you would be running on a Magdk, for example, you gain the reduction because persistence reduces all skills, whether they're magic or stamina, whenever you block, by 15%. After blocking an attack, your next magic or stamina ability costs 15% less. So if you were to put persistence in there, now we are literally talking half the cost of DK's shield, which works the same way. You're trading one resource for another. You're literally trading half of your Magicka for 6k stam. It literally gives you 6 times the amount and heals you for half the cost. of what DKs does. Also gives you access to persistence. You have unholy knowledge, again, more regen, lowers your cost for both your stam as well as your magic abilities. Blood magic heals you for 10%. Again, this is a stand your ground passive. Why? Because of Daedric Mines. You have 5 mines around you. You can play this like a stand your ground build, and you have access to literally 50% of your HP is returned to you when someone walks through your mines. And it costs 15% less. Because when you block, you drop mines, and it costs 4,300. There is no comparison to Magdk. There's no way Magdk has anything that's very similar. Again, when you cast a dark magic ability, you grant yourself minor prophecy to you and your group. Again, Magdk lacks healing, lacks access to a lot of critical outside of using Flames of Oblivion. They have access to a better root because their root is literally 3 times the size of Talon's, and it slows them afterwards or it does damage. Again, looking back, regen, more regen, energized, more damage. It's 5% to all damage, not a specific type of damage. It gives both physical as well as shock related to doing shock damage. They have a passive execute as well as an active passive spammable execute that also acts as regen. And then of course, expert mage, more damage based on the amount of abilities slotted. So when you compare Magdk, that is supposed to be the stand your ground build, it's supposed to be winning the war of attrition, but yet you take a look at Sorcerer, the Sorcerer passives are far better at standing their ground than Magdk, and yet Magdk is supposed to be the class that is designed to stand your ground, and it needs a huge rework. I could touch on the Templar passives, the Nightblade passives, the Warden passives. There are just so many other classes that have far better passives in their ability to stand their ground, and yet Magdk is forced to live without an execute, and yet it doesn't do the job that it's designed to do any better than any other class. The only reason you see magic DKs or DKs as tanks is because of chains and because of their ability to utilize Igneous to gain some stamina back. Outside of that, if you were to use things like the chains from Fighters Guild, there are more and more ways for other classes to do basically what Magdk does, and I'm actually going to release a build next week as a sorcerer doing what Magdk does, and I'm going to do it better. And again, I'm going to revisit the passives of the sorcerer, talking about this, and hopefully we'll get a lot of changes. Magdk needs a lot of changes to be, in essence, brought up to date to the PvP world that it lives in, so that it can actually, again, I don't care about having an execute, but at the very least, let the Magdk do what it's designed to without being pigeonholed into doing no damage. To be able to block really well and to hold your ground, you have to forego a lot of damage as well as recovery just for the ability to block damage. And again, your healing is based off of your damage, and Magdk is the only build that's forced to be balanced. It's forced to choose between recovery and tankiness and damage, and either you go too far into one, you end up having to forego the others or both. And so hopefully we'll get a change to that with some of the coming patches. Hopefully someone and the developers will take a look at this and make some necessary changes for the benefit of the community of us who love Magdk and love playing Magdk, but like to see Magdk brought into a more favorable light when it comes to PvPing and being able to do what it's designed to do, which is standing its ground. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe.